A Chip Off the Old Block by Claire McGee, Flaxland 2774. Narrated by David Tredinnick. You're a chip off the old block. Joe noticed that lots of people said this to him since his return. Was it true? Is there anything about me that makes me unique, or am I just a more recent model of my dad, he thought. Was it that he just looked like his father, tall, well-built, with deep, pool-like eyes, not to mention a cheeky grin that could disarm most people, or was it something more? Deep down, he knew there were traits that he'd inherited from his father, but also others he'd rejected, all of which made him the man he was today. He had returned home to attend his father's funeral. It went off without a hitch. The priest spoke warmly about his father and how well respected and loved he had been within the community. He praised Bill's strong work ethic, his desire to help others and give back. His father's friends and work colleagues gathered back at the family home for the wake. Joe's father always said that his funeral was to be a celebration of a life well lived and not a time of mourning. He would have been happy with the turnout, thought Joe. It was interesting to hear what people were saying about his dad as he moved around the room. "Bill would give you the shirt off his back if you needed it," said Tom. "Yeah, right there, but he'd cut you down to size if he didn't agree with you, especially when it came to the church. He didn't suffer fools gladly," laughed Steve. "True, very true. A kind of man you couldn't help to meet, was Bill, but he definitely had a fiery temper," interjected Greg, who had wandered over to the group. Joe appreciated those traits in his dad. It was something he felt could be said of him. He didn't have his father's blind faith in the Catholic Church, but he definitely saw himself as a humanitarian and someone who was happy to help people in need. Perhaps he was more like his father than he cared to admit. As Joe continued to mingle with the guests, he heard others talking about his dad's great sense of fun and love of his family, always happy to bring a smile to someone. This was definitely a trait that Joe believed was part of his makeup. His father would regularly have a game of cricket with him and his brother, or help them build a cubby house, even after a hard day at work. His father always acknowledged the efforts of Joe's mother, treating her with care and love. As a boy, he'd catch his father putting his arm around her waist whilst she cooked, or would kiss her after dinner as a thank you. He'd bring her flowers regularly and would comment to the boys about how lovely she looked, often making his mother roll her eyes and laugh. That didn't mean that his dad was perfect. His father did have a short fuse and would meter out discipline to him and his brother, sometimes for what to Joe seemed to be minor infractions. Joe remembered one occasion when his father came home and he hadn't put the bins out for collection. His father was so angry he was physically shaking. Joe made a quick escape out of his father's reach in order to avoid a belting that he thought might be coming his way. A belting was something he and his brother received on more than one occasion over the years. He wasn't really a violent man, but he also wasn't what one would call a modern man. This was never more evident than when it came to the Catholic Church. His father was opposed to many of society's changing attitudes because it was part of the Church's doctrine. This was definitely not part of Joe's makeup and was often a bone of contention between the two men. As the night drew in and everyone had left and his mother and he were alone, she said, "Your father wanted you to have this." She handed him an old biscuit tin, patting his arm as she did so. He poured himself a large whiskey and sat at the well-worn kitchen table, placing the biscuit tin down gently. Inside, he found every birthday card, drawing, note and letter he'd ever written to his father. As he read a card or a letter, placing each carefully to one side, the memories of his relationship with his father came flooding back. Mixed emotions for Joe. Anger and frustration about his father's rigid attitude, pride in his dad's community work. However, the overwhelming emotion was that of love. As he drove to the airport, the tin box carefully packed in his suitcase, Joe came to realize that he had inherited many of his father's traits. A willingness to help others, a loving husband and father. However, Joe also knew that what made him the man he was also reflected his own life experiences and his ability to reject some of the traits his father possessed. He was a much more tolerant man when it came to society and its complexities. Perhaps this was because he didn't have a strong religious dogma. He was proud that he'd never used physical violence as a means of discipline with his own child. Yet, there were times when he knew he could be stubborn and single-minded, perhaps more times than he'd like to acknowledge. That night, when he got home, he found a card on his office laptop from his son, welcoming him home. Joe carefully placed it in an old biscuit tin, along with all the other cards and notes he had been given by his son over the years. Joe realised that perhaps it wasn't all bad being a chip off the old block. The end.